When I first moved into the house, everything felt like it was waiting for me to fill it. The walls were bare, the air still, the furniture arranged in careful symmetry as if no one had ever really lived here before. It wasn't just a new place. It was a symbol, an offering, a kind of quiet plea for reinvention. The kind people make to themselves after years of pretending that what they had was enough. I had spent so long floating between muted versions of myself that the idea of starting over seemed almost unreal. But there I was, keys in hand, watching the sunlight pour across a floor that wasn't mine until I chose to make it so. She greeted me with warmth and patience. Her voice was soft in the mornings and quieter in the evenings. She moved around the house like someone who had long ago given up on chaos and now clung to calm as her one act of rebellion against the world. I liked that about her. She didn't ask too many questions, didn't press into corners I wasn't ready to uncover. She simply let me settle, gave me space to breathe, and in return, I tried to be the version of myself that would deserve such kindness. For the first few days, everything was simple, clean, quiet. Then there was him. Her son had just turned 18. He lived there too. His presence was casual, unbothered, with a rhythm that suggested he had long since claimed the house as his own. He didn't seem to notice me at first. Or maybe he did and simply chose not to show it. He moved with that effortless ease boys sometimes carry right at the edge of adulthood. Not yet hardened by disappointment, not yet dulled by repetition. He was tall and lean, always barefoot indoors, his voice still clinging to its youthful cadence but already carrying the depth of something older. I told myself he was just a kid. A teenager. My girlfriend's son. Nothing more. And for a while, that worked. We crossed paths in the kitchen, in the hallway, near the back porch. I said good morning. He nodded. Sometimes he'd be on the couch watching something with headphones in, legs stretched out across the cushions, shirt haphazardly slung on the armrest. I'd glance over and keep walking. It was routine, harmless, unremarkable. But slowly, the details began to register more clearly than I expected. The curve of his back as he leaned over the sink. The damp line of sweat across his collarbone after coming in from the sun. The quiet confidence in the way he occupied space, never asking permission but never flaunting anything either. There was nothing overt about it. Nothing deliberate. And that was precisely what made it harder to ignore. He wasn't trying to catch my attention. He just existed, and in doing so, drew mine. At first, I chalked it up to observation. I was adjusting. I was learning the layout, the sounds, the small rituals of the house. I noticed the way the cabinets creaked when he opened them. The kind of cereal he ate. The music that sometimes drifted through his half-closed door late at night. All of it, I told myself, was just awareness. Nothing more. But awareness has its own gravity. And soon, I found myself listening for the echo of his footsteps, anticipating his entry into a room, waiting for the brush of his presence the way one might wait for weather to change. I didn't seek him out. Not really. But I didn't avoid him either. There were moments, too many, if I'm honest, when I would linger a little longer in the kitchen if I heard him coming downstairs. When I would slow my pace down the hallway just in case he looked up. When I would open the window shades just slightly more to let in the light that always seemed to wrap itself around him. I told myself it was harmless. I wasn't acting on anything. I wasn't crossing any lines. I was just noticing. But noticing has a way of becoming remembering. And remembering turns into imagining, and suddenly your mind is no longer a safe place. It's filled with images you didn't mean to carry, thoughts you swore you had left behind years ago. Things you buried under layers of reason and restraint, only to find them still alive and breathing when someone unexpected walks into your life and smiles at you like they don't know what they're doing. Or maybe they do. And maybe that's what terrifies you the most. It wasn't just physical. That's what surprised me. Yes, he was beautiful in that unfiltered, effortless way, skin still soft with youth, eyes that held both mischief and melancholy. But it was more than that. It was the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was more than just a fixture in his house. Like I was something to be understood. It was the way his voice would lower when he spoke to me directly, the way his fingers curled around the edge of the counter when we were in the same room, as if holding himself back from something unnamed. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it. That I was just lonely, just grateful for a house that finally felt like it had a heartbeat. But each day the distance between what I felt and what I allowed myself to feel grew smaller. It was like trying to walk through fog while pretending you could still see the road ahead. One afternoon, I came home early. The house was quiet. I stepped into my room to find the faintest scent of his cologne in the air, something citrusy and sharp, barely there but unmistakable. My door hadn't been closed all the way. I paused, looking around. Nothing was out of place. But the feeling lingered. Had he been here? If so, why? I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the scent had drifted down the hall. Maybe the door had shifted on its own. But something in my chest tightened, and that tightness didn't go away. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside rustling the trees. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear music leaking through his door. A slow, pulsing rhythm. I imagined him lying on his bed, one arm behind his head, lost in thought. And I wondered, was he thinking of me the way I was thinking of him? Did he sense the shift between us? Or was it only me, caught in the undertow of something I couldn't name? I didn't have answers. I only had questions. And beneath those questions, a truth I had never dared to speak aloud. Not until now. Not until he walked into my world without asking and turned everything I thought I knew into something uncertain, trembling, alive. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something. Something that lived in the quiet between us. Something neither of us had said, but both of us had already heard. It began with small interruptions in the silence, almost imperceptible at first. The way he lingered in the hallway just a few seconds longer than necessary. The soft sound of his steps retreating, pausing just outside my door. The occasional glance that seemed to last too long, followed by the sharp look away, as if nothing had happened at all. But I noticed. And even more dangerous than that, I started to wait for it. Our daily rhythms fell into place with a kind of unnerving symmetry. Mornings were quiet, the soft hum of the coffee maker filling the space before anyone spoke. He would wander into the kitchen, barefoot, hair still tousled from sleep, the waistband of his shorts sitting carelessly on his hips. He never seemed to be in a rush. He moved through the house like someone who had nothing to prove. I watched him, discreetly at first, then less so. He noticed, I know he did, but he never said anything. He never had to. There was an evening when the house felt particularly still. Diane had gone to bed early, tired after another long shift, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. The television was on, volume low, casting flickering light across the walls. He sat on the far end of the couch, legs stretched out, one arm behind his head, watching me more than the screen. I could feel his gaze. It pressed against my skin like heat. I kept my eyes on the screen, pretending not to notice, but inside I was unraveling thread by thread. Something had shifted, and we both knew it. It wasn't a conversation or a confession. It was something weightless and wordless, growing in the space between our movements, the quiet pauses in our daily routine. He no longer seemed unsure of himself around me. If anything, he became bolder, closer in proximity, slower in motion. He brushed past me in narrow spaces without apology. He leaned on doorframes with that same quiet confidence, letting his eyes settle on me just a beat too long. One night, I was in my room with the door slightly ajar. I had the lamp on, its glow soft and warm against the evening dim. I heard a noise in the hallway, a creak, the rustle of fabric. I turned my head slightly and saw him there, standing just beyond the threshold. He didn't speak, didn't step forward, only looked at me. We held each other's gaze for a moment that felt suspended in time, and then, just as quietly, he turned and walked away. I sat in that silence long after he'd gone, heart pounding, the image of his silhouette burned into my mind. After that, I began to anticipate the sound of him. The light fall of his footsteps on the stairs, the murmur of his voice from the other room, the occasional thump of music from his bedroom. Every sound was a signal. Every movement an echo of something waiting to be acknowledged. I stopped pretending not to care. I stopped lying to myself about the way my body reacted whenever he entered the room. It wasn't about resistance anymore, it was about restraint, fragile and thin and slipping between my fingers. We began crossing each other more often, hallways, kitchens, shared spaces. He always moved like he belonged, but now there was an edge to it, a kind of tension that neither of us named but both of us felt. His presence became a tether, invisible and taut, pulling at me whenever I tried to detach. It was never overt. It was in the way he laughed when I entered a room, the way he stood too close behind me when I cooked, the way he didn't move away fast enough when our shoulders brushed. I told myself he was just being friendly, that I was projecting, but the lie became harder to carry each day. I began to look forward to his company in ways that felt dangerous. I lingered longer in shared spaces, responded too quickly when he spoke, found myself standing at the top of the stairs just to hear his voice. I studied the way he moved, the way he rested his hand on the edge of the counter, the curve of his back when he bent over to pick something up. I memorized the shape of him without meaning to. He started entering my space more freely, knocking once and then stepping inside, or hovering in the doorway like he was waiting for an invitation I never gave but somehow always implied. One afternoon, I found him sitting on my bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, smiled faintly, and kept sitting. I didn't tell him to leave. I didn't ask why he was there. I just sat in the armchair across from him and pretended not to feel the earth shift beneath my feet. It was no longer about wondering if something was happening. It was about accepting that it already had. The quiet between us had become something charged and dangerous, something that hummed beneath the surface of even the most mundane interactions. I could feel it in my chest, in my breath, in the way I looked away just a second too late. That evening, I lay awake again, the ceiling above me unfamiliar and too still. I thought about the way he had looked at me in the hallway. The way he had sat on my bed like it belonged to him. The way I hadn't done a thing to stop him. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was inventing it. But the truth was already rooted deep. It wasn't just about the way he made me feel. It was about the way he looked at me like he knew exactly what I was afraid to admit. This wasn't infatuation. It wasn't fantasy. It was something quieter and heavier. It lived in the silences we shared, in the glances that lingered, in the growing ache that neither of us had dared to voice. Something in me had started to soften, to bend toward him without permission. And I didn't know if it could be bent back again. I realized then that the silence between us was no longer empty. It had become a language. One we both understood. One we both spoke, without saying a single word. The heat arrived without ceremony, slipping into the house like an invisible fog, clinging to the windows and seeping into the walls. Every surface grew warm to the touch. Even the light that filtered through the blinds felt thick and heavy, coating everything in gold. It was the kind of heat that blurred edges, that slowed thoughts, that turned time into something soft and malleable. The air barely moved. The fan spun lazily overhead, moving nothing but expectation. And in that slow collapse of temperature and sound, something inside me began to change shape. She had started working longer shifts, often gone from early afternoon until well past midnight. Her presence in the house became more like a memory, a faint trail of perfume near the sink or the neat fold of a towel left in the bathroom. With her absence came silence, and with silence came the return of that rhythm, just him and me again, orbiting each other through the rooms, brushing past each other in the hallways, exchanging looks that never said what they meant. He had stopped wearing shirts almost entirely. Most days he walked around in mesh shorts and nothing else, damp from a morning run or a quick swim in the backyard pool. His skin had taken on the color of late summer, golden, sun-warmed, glowing. He moved through the house like someone who didn't know he was being watched, or worse, someone who did. His body had the effortless ease of someone still becoming himself, but confident in the way he took up space. He would sprawl on the couch, one leg draped over the armrest, earbuds in, eyes half-lidded in thought or music or nothing at all. He didn't acknowledge me when I entered the room. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to fill it completely. I tried to keep my distance, but the house made that nearly impossible. Every hallway narrowed us together. Every countertop seemed too small. Every shared glance dragged a little too long. I found myself waiting for the sound of his footsteps, for the moment he would come down the stairs shirtless and flushed from sleep. I caught myself lingering in doorways, pretending to look for something. I turned my back to him when I felt my restraint thinning, only to find myself imagining his expression anyway. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen slicing fruit when he walked in behind me, sweat still shining on his back, the faint smell of chlorine clinging to his skin. He opened the fridge, leaned in, and stayed there longer than necessary. I watched the muscles shift under his skin, the curve of his shoulder blades, the slow rise and fall of his breath. I forced my eyes back to the cutting board, suddenly hyper-aware of my own hands, the fruit slipping in my grip. When he straightened, I could feel the heat of his body behind me, the air stretching thin and tight. He said nothing. He left the room like he hadn't just split me open from the inside. Nights were worse. The heat settled deeper after dark, the air in the bedroom heavy and unmoving. I lay on top of the sheets, barely dressed, trying to will sleep into me. I listened for every sound, the soft closing of a door, the padding of bare feet on the stairs, the creak of the floorboard near the laundry room. Each noise pulled at me like thread, each silence louder than the last. I imagined him moving through the house, just as restless, just as undone. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. My body reacted all the same. We began eating meals together more often, not out of plan but habit. I would find him already at the table, shirtless, sipping something cold, his long fingers tapping the side of the glass. He never looked up right away, and when he did, there was always something in his gaze, not invitation, not challenge, but curiosity. As if he was still deciding whether or not to cross a line. I never made it easier for him. I never made it harder, either. The silence between us became crowded with possibilities. Every time he entered the room, I felt my body respond before my mind could object. Every breath I took was measured, every word I spoke rehearsed in my head before it left my mouth. I started to fear stillness more than confrontation, because in stillness, I could feel the full weight of what was happening. It wasn't just desire. It was attention, awareness, pull. One evening, I walked past his room and saw his door open wide. He was lying on his bed, one arm draped over his forehead, his chest bare, the curve of his ribs visible in the dim light. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did. I stood there for a moment too long, caught in the shape of him, the quiet of him, the sheer intimacy of the scene. I forced myself to keep walking, but the image clung to me like heat. I carried it with me for the rest of the night, into sleep, into dreams I couldn't control. He started appearing beside me more often, on the porch, on the couch, on the edge of the bed when I was folding laundry. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was a kind of language, one I was learning to read in silence. A shift of weight. A glance from under his lashes. The way he would lean just close enough for his shoulder to brush mine, then stay there, unflinching. I convinced myself I was still in control. That I could manage this, name it, contain it. But control is a fragile thing, and heat does strange things to the mind. I stopped journaling. I stopped reading. I stopped trying to distract myself. Everything felt hollow next to him. Everything else lost its texture. There was one night when the power went out during a storm. The house fell into a deep, humming quiet. We lit candles and sat in the living room while rain pounded against the windows. He sat on the floor near my legs, head tilted back, eyes shining in the flicker of flame. I stared at him for too long. He didn't move. He didn't ask. He simply existed, and that was enough to unravel me. The glass windows steamed in the heat. Every breath felt stolen. Every thought a risk. I began to dream of nothing but water and fire, stillness and touch. He had become the center of my awareness, the heat in the house nothing compared to the warmth he left behind after every passing moment. I had thought I was building a new life with her. But it was her son who was shaping the walls around me now. And I was letting him. It came without warning. Not like thunder or flame, but like breath, soft, quiet, and undeniable. After all the days of tension, the unspoken exchanges, the weight of silence thickening between us like smoke, I expected something dramatic. A spark, a moment of rupture, something that would tear through the fabric of restraint and leave no doubt about what had been building. But instead, it arrived like simplicity, as if it had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged without fear or resistance. That morning began like any other. The sun rose behind closed blinds, casting long, faint lines across the floorboards. The air was still heavy, but not unbearable. I moved through the house in the usual rhythm, coffee, a glance at my phone, the quiet creak of the fridge door. Then I heard his footsteps. Bare, unhurried. He entered the kitchen the way he always did, but there was something different, almost imperceptible. He didn't speak, but his eyes met mine for just a second too long, and in that glance, something loosened inside me. From that moment forward, everything became slower, easier. There was no sharp edge to the quiet anymore. It no longer vibrated with tension but hummed with something calmer, warmer. He stayed in the kitchen with me, not doing anything in particular, just leaning against the counter, sipping from a glass, watching me move. There was no reason to speak. We simply existed in the same room, and it felt natural, like an arrangement long overdue. I wasn't trying to avoid him anymore, and he wasn't pretending not to notice the shift. Later, we both found ourselves in the living room. He was lying on the floor, arms crossed behind his head, legs stretched out lazily. I sat on the couch, book in hand, though I wasn't reading. The air between us was soft, forgiving. He would glance at me from time to time, not with suggestion or teasing, but with something else, recognition, maybe. Or permission. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the tension that used to clutch at my chest had dissolved into something that felt dangerously close to peace. He started showing up more. Not in grand gestures or surprises, just in moments. Sitting beside me on the porch when the sun dipped low. Walking into the room and resting his head on the back of the couch for a beat before sitting down. Standing close enough that I could smell the salt on his skin, feel the low heat radiating from his body. These weren't tests. These weren't challenges. They were offerings, quiet ones, strung together through repetition. They asked for nothing, but they lingered. That night, after the heat had begun to retreat and the moon was resting low over the rooftops, he knocked once on my door and stepped in. It wasn't unusual anymore. He did it often, sometimes to ask a question, sometimes to simply exist in the same space with me for a few minutes before wandering back to his room. But this time, he didn't speak, didn't move beyond the threshold. He stood there, watching me. I sat at the edge of my bed, looking back. The air pulsed around us, but not with fear. There was no urgency. Only understanding. Eventually, he crossed the room and sat beside me. Not close. Not far. Just enough to feel him there. Our shoulders didn't touch, but they could have. And still, no words. We looked ahead, into the quiet, as if waiting for something that had already happened. It wasn't about permission anymore. It wasn't about morality or lines or resistance. It was about gravity. Two people, pulled by the same unseen force, no longer pretending otherwise. His presence beside me felt familiar in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't flinch. I didn't move away. I simply stayed, breathing slowly, sensing the rhythm of his breath syncing with mine. And that was the moment I understood, this didn't need to be chased. It didn't need to be questioned. It had grown its roots in silence, and now it was blooming without effort. When he finally stood and left, the room didn't feel emptier. It felt marked, changed, held. He didn't say goodnight. He didn't look back. But everything had shifted. Not because of a kiss or a touch or a confession. Because we had finally stopped pretending that nothing existed between us. The next day continued in the same quiet ease. I found him on the back porch, feet propped on the railing, eyes closed, the early sun warming his skin. I joined him without hesitation. We didn't speak, didn't fill the air with anything but breath. He passed me a cold drink, and I took it without comment. We sat there for what felt like hours, just being. It was astonishing, how simple it all became. How natural. How everything that once felt dangerous now seemed inevitable. The looks we exchanged carried no heat, only depth. The way he walked into a room no longer made my heart race in fear, it made it expand. I no longer felt like I was teetering on the edge. I had stepped over, and somehow, the world hadn't ended. It had softened. We continued our routine, but now it was laced with awareness, with softness, with a quiet thread of mutual understanding. I began to notice his silences not as absence but as presence. I read the way he tilted his head, the way he leaned on the doorframe, the small smile that sometimes curved his lips when he thought I wasn't looking. And maybe he wasn't trying to seduce me. Maybe it wasn't about conquest or rebellion or risk. Maybe he just wanted to be seen, and for some reason, I was the one he chose to see him. And maybe I wanted to be seen too. Maybe that's what this all had been building toward. In that simplicity, there was no need for explanations. No grand turning point. Just a quiet clarity that settled over everything. A warmth that spread slowly, like sun on glass. A knowing that neither of us had to speak aloud. Reality didn't crash down like a wave. It returned like fog lifting from a field, slowly, gently, and then all at once, revealing what had been there all along. The soft stillness of our unspoken bond had stretched like a bubble over those summer days, a cocoon that wrapped itself around us in the absence of consequence. But bubbles don't last forever. The first rupture came with the sound of her voice in the hallway, back from a long shift, cheerful and unaware. Her presence filled the house again, not unwelcome, but jarring, like suddenly waking from a dream too soon. She kissed me on the cheek like she always did, set her bag down, and began to talk about mundane things, grocery prices, traffic, something her coworker said. I smiled and nodded and responded, but inside I felt distant, like I was watching myself act out the role of the man I was supposed to be. Her son walked in a few minutes later, barefoot, freshly showered, hair still damp. He said hello and leaned casually against the doorway, his eyes flicking toward me for just a moment. It was a look I couldn't explain to her, and one I didn't want to explain to myself. Something inside me tightened. The house changed with her return. The quiet that once wrapped around me now felt dense, like pressure. Every word spoken had weight again. Every action became performative. I found myself hyper-aware of everything, how close he stood to me, how long he looked at me, the way my hand brushed the counter when he was near. I pulled away more often. I busied myself with work, with repairs, with errands that didn't really need doing. But even in avoidance, I could feel his gaze trailing behind me. Not accusing. Not demanding. Just, steady. We no longer had the house to ourselves, and so every interaction returned to its original form, safe, shallow, nothing to question. But beneath the surface, I felt the undertow. It wasn't gone. It had simply gone quiet. And in that silence, I began to notice the ache of absence, even as he sat across the dinner table. I noticed the subtle pauses before he answered her questions. The way he sometimes looked at me as if waiting for a cue I no longer gave. We became polite. Respectful. Distant. The way strangers pretend not to know each other after sharing something unspeakable. There was a night when the three of us sat on the couch, a movie playing that none of us paid attention to. She had her head on my shoulder, dozing softly. He was at the far end, knees drawn up, eyes on the screen but unfocused. I didn't look at him directly, but I felt him, the shape of his silence pressing against mine. I wondered if he could feel how far away I had drifted inside. I wondered if he resented me for it. I wondered if I resented myself. The next morning, I caught him in the hallway as I was leaving for the store. He stepped aside for me to pass, but our arms brushed. It was a small touch, the kind that could be passed off as nothing, but my entire body reacted like a fault line cracking beneath the surface. I didn't look back. I didn't say anything. I just walked out the door and into the sun, breathing as if I'd just come up from underwater. When I returned, he was gone. A note on the table said he was at a friend's house. She was upstairs napping. The house was still again, but not in the way it had been before. This stillness felt empty. Echoing. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the grain of the table, wondering what part of me I had buried to survive the return of normalcy. Reality demanded shape, logic, reason. It didn't allow for the softness we had found in the quiet. It didn't make space for feelings that couldn't be explained. So I did what was expected. I cleaned. I cooked. I held her hand when we walked through the neighborhood in the evenings. And every time he walked into the room, I looked past him as if he were just another piece of the household. I betrayed nothing. At least not outwardly. But inside, the pull remained. Quieter now, but no less strong. It came in the form of memory, flashes of his presence, the echo of his breath beside me, the warmth of his nearness in those suspended hours we had shared. I began to mourn something I had never really had. Not fully. I mourned the softness in his eyes, the easy curve of his mouth when he looked at me without fear. I mourned the silence that had once felt sacred. I started to withdraw, not just from him but from everything. My thoughts dulled. My smile became hollow. She noticed, asked if something was wrong, and I shook my head too quickly. I lied with ease, because I had to. The truth was too large to name. Too fragile to expose. I couldn't tell her that I had fallen into something I didn't understand. That her son had seen a part of me I hadn't let anyone see in years. That in his quiet, patient way, he had offered me something closer to truth than I had ever allowed myself to want. He began to keep his distance too. Whether out of respect or disappointment, I couldn't tell. He no longer entered my room without knocking. He no longer lingered in the kitchen. Our eyes met less often. When they did, it was brief, cautious, like we had both agreed to protect something by not acknowledging it. And maybe that was the only way it could survive now, not as a living thing, but as a memory wrapped in secrecy. One night I woke in the middle of a storm. Rain hammered the windows. Thunder rumbled across the sky like a slow breath. I got out of bed and wandered through the dark house, every creaking board a reminder of what had passed. I stood in the doorway to the living room and saw the shape of him asleep on the couch, half covered in a throw blanket, mouth slightly open, peaceful in a way that stabbed at me. I stood there longer than I should have, the sound of the storm pressing against the glass behind me. I didn't wake him. I didn't speak. I just watched, aching in a way I couldn't put into words. When I turned and walked back to my room, I carried the silence with me like a wound I didn't want to close. That was the moment I realized reality wasn't a return. It was a reckoning. It didn't demand answers. It simply exposed them. And all I could do now was keep walking forward, carrying the weight of something beautiful that could never fully exist again, not because it wasn't real, but because it was. Because it had been, briefly, and in that truth, nothing else could quite compare. Night became the only time I could think clearly. Not because anything was resolved, but because the world slowed down enough for me to feel the shape of everything I had been avoiding. In the dark, the house softened. It no longer asked questions. It no longer demanded roles. It just breathed around me, walls humming with memory, air heavy with what I couldn't say aloud. I would sit in the quiet, lights low, letting the darkness settle against my skin like a second layer, until I forgot what I was supposed to be and remembered who I was when no one else was watching. Days had returned to something resembling normal. She moved around the house again, filling it with chatter and rhythm and familiar rituals. Her son and I became silhouettes of ourselves, reduced to polite nods and measured silence. And yet beneath that stillness, the truth lived on, moving between us in the pauses. A look across the room. A breath held a second too long. The distance between us wasn't avoidance, it was containment. We both knew what had been born in the quiet. We both knew it hadn't died. He still occupied my thoughts, not as fantasy, but as something rooted, grounded. He had stopped trying to reach for me. Or maybe he hadn't stopped, maybe I had simply stopped allowing myself to feel it. And yet I could still sense it, pulsing beneath the surface like a current just out of reach. Every time he entered a room, I felt my body respond before my mind had the chance to intercept. It wasn't desire anymore, not only. It was recognition. A sense of being seen. I began to wonder who I had been before him. What parts of myself I had sealed off, convinced they were dangerous or foolish or impossible. I remembered moments from years ago, flashes of discomfort, of longings I couldn't name. I had pushed them down then, buried them beneath the pursuit of something simpler. A career. A woman. A life that looked like safety. But safety was only silence in a different shape. It had taken him to unearth it, to look at me with eyes that didn't demand, just understood. And once I felt that, there was no going back. I spent more time alone. Not out of shame, but out of necessity. I needed the quiet again, but this time not to hide. This time, to hear myself. I would lie awake at night, staring into the ceiling, asking questions I couldn't yet answer. Had I changed? Or had I just stopped pretending? Was this love? Or longing? Did it matter? All I knew was that the version of myself I had tried to maintain had cracked under the weight of something real. And in the silence that followed, I had glimpsed who I might actually be. There were nights when I sat on the back porch long after everyone had gone to bed, the sky wide and cloudless above me, stars scattered like unresolved thoughts. I would sip my drink and feel the breeze move through the trees, imagining what it would feel like to live without pretending. Without dividing myself into acceptable pieces. Without lying for the comfort of others. He had never asked me to change. He had simply looked at me and made me want to. I stopped rehearsing excuses in my head. I stopped trying to rewrite the past few weeks into something more palatable. What happened between us had not been a mistake. It had been quiet, delicate, complicated, but it had been real. And whatever came next, I didn't want to carry it like a shadow. I wanted to carry it like a truth. Not a declaration, not a confession. Just an acknowledgement. I had felt something. I had wanted someone. And that someone had seen me. Eventually, he started to linger again. Not in the obvious ways. Just small things. Sitting beside me on the edge of the porch instead of across the yard. pausing in the doorway like he might say something, then walking away. I no longer reached for him. I didn't need to. The connection between us was not a thing that needed action. It just needed to be held without shame. One evening, he came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He stood beside me for a moment, close enough that our arms nearly touched. Then he reached for a glass, filled it with water, and walked out. But in that passing, in the heat between our bodies, I felt it again, the simplicity that had once made everything feel possible. I think that's when I knew. That love, or whatever it was we had shared, wasn't always about possession or confession. Sometimes, it was about presence. About being seen in your most honest form and not looking away. He had given me that. Without demands. Without expectation. Just a mirror held up in silence. I never spoke of it to anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because it wasn't something to explain. It was something to carry. Like a stone smoothed by water, tucked into a pocket. A reminder of who I had been, and who I had started to become. The darkness stopped feeling like a hiding place. It began to feel like home. Not because it offered escape, but because it allowed truth. In the dark, I could finally be myself, not the version shaped by fear or duty, but the one shaped by feeling. By memory. By quiet, impossible connection. And though the world moved on, unchanged, I no longer did. I remained altered. Subtly. Permanently. Not by what we did or didn't do, but by what we saw in each other. That was enough. That was everything.